Okay, hello again. Last time we saw how to add dynamic or input insert effects into all 8 inputs. Now, another type of effect, which can also be used at any time, is the send effect. Now, before diving straight in with which buttons you need to press, I'm going to take a diversion, as it seems a lot of confusion is really down to general concepts as opposed to the machine itself. So apologies if you know all this already. You can always fast forward. So, insert effects, send effects, why have both? We touched on this last time, and it's more about how an effect is used rather than the effect itself. An insert effect is any effect which is inserted into the signal path by breaking the path. The original dry signal is completely replaced by whatever comes out of the effect, which is the wet signal. A send effect is any effect which has a portion of the original signal sent to it without breaking the path. The effect output, or the wet signal, is returned to the mixing system so it can be mixed with everything else, including the untouched original dry signal. An obvious example is the echo effect, and this will sound wrong if you use it as an insert effect because you've replaced the original in-time signal with its out-of-sync version. Now, other time-related effects like reverbs may sound unrealistic for the same reason. But if we use them as send effects, then the original signal is still available for mixing back in. Now, there are no hard and fast rules. You may even want this type of sound, but also the distinction between the two uses is blurred. Some effects, and not on this machine though, allow a portion of their input signal to pass through unaffected, regardless of how the effect is used. So they have their own built-in wet and dry mix control. And typically you'd set this control depending on whether you use the effect as an insert or a send effect. Okay, that's the difference. So what about send effects in practice? Well, it helps if you think of it as two different concepts. One is the send routing, the other is the send effect, and there's nothing stopping you from using the routing without the effect. Now, the routing is just a way of tapping off a portion of each signal, a submix if you like, and sending it somewhere else, either internally or to the outside world. This machine has two of these systems, completely independent, called Send 1 and Send 2. You can see them in the mixer screen. This green area here, Send, Effect 1 and Effect 2. And they also come out on the sockets on the back of the machine. Now, other mixers are very similar. They may have more or less sends, and they may call them auxiliary or aux sends, or FX sends, or monitor sends, but they're all basically the same. On this machine, the sockets are labelled Effect Send 1 and Effect Send 2, but don't let the word effect distract you. How you use them is down to your imagination. You could feed an external effect unit, and this would be the send effect, and you'd return its output back to the mixer using a spare input. You could also feed a monitor system with it, headphones or a PA for a performer to keep in time with other signals. Or you could feed a recorder to record a subset of your main mix. So how is the send signal tapped off in the first place? It can be taken from anywhere along the signal path. So where's the best place? Well, one way is to take the signal before the level fader, and this means the send signal is unaffected by any mixing activity. And this might be useful for a performer's monitoring system. They don't want their levels messed about with while you're trying to balance the signals for the main PA. Another way is to take it after the level fader. This means its level will change as the main level changes. So if you faded the main signal down to 0, the send level would also fade down to 0. And this might be useful for an effect, where you want the amount of effect to keep in step with the original dry signal. Now, these before and after variations are called pre-fader and post-fader, or pre and post. Now this machine is nice and flexible as it has both options on both send 1 and send 2. You can set them here. So that's the route to the outside world. What about internally? Well, the send 1 signal also goes to a single internal send effect, and you can adjust some of its settings from the effects screen. Now this looks more complicated than it need be, as the screen is shared with another type of effect, which has actually come up now, called the insert guitar effect, which I'll cover later. So it's not surprising this area causes some headaches. Now the F1 button toggles between the two types. Unfortunately, the name of this button is not consistent. It changes to indicate which type will be displayed when it is pressed. So its name is the exact opposite of the actual screen being displayed. In other words, when guitar is shown, like here, pressing it will go to the guitar effects screen. When send is shown, pressing the button will go to the send effects screen. Now this could have been so much simpler, but you'll just have to accept it unless they do a firmware upgrade. So this single internal send effect can either be a reverb, a chorus, or a delay, but only one type at any one time. Now notice they're all time-related effects, which fits in with their use as a send effect. Here's the send effect on the block diagram. The signals enter the block from the left and come out from the right. So let's follow the path from the input. Previously we reached the stereo assign section on the diagram. Now this switch is represented by the assign screen on the real mixer, and as we saw before, you can route any or all of the 8 inputs anywhere you like. For now we've just looked at routing them to the stereo bus because we're just using this as a basic 8-track mixer. Now on the diagram, just after the switch, we just followed the top path. So now we'll look at the bottom 2. Now these paths correspond to send 1 and send 2. In other words, you've got 2 completely independent submix systems. Each signal goes to a pre and post switch. Now these switches are controlled in the mixer screen. And as mentioned before, don't forget to select the required source or input before changing anything on this screen. Now the switch symbol is just like the previous switches but drawn backwards, so you can imagine the central line pivoting around the right-hand blob. It can either be in the pre position, as shown here, as selected on the mixer screen, it's pre, and this lets the signal through from before the input level control. So in this case, the send signal will not be affected by any input level adjustment. Now the post position lets the signal through from after the level control, so this will be affected by any of these level adjustments. And hopefully you'll now know why these pre and post variations are useful and which one to use. The diagram shows the send on-off as a separate switch for clarity, but in the mixer screen it's combined with the pre and post options, so you have 3 possible choices. You have off, you have on pre, or on post. Each send signal then goes to its own level control. This is shown in the mixer here and is controlled by these 2 physical knobs, send 1 and send 2. And just like the EQ and pan controls, you can turn them without having the mixer screen open. But either way, you must select the required input or source before touching them. Now we saw before how the main signals join up with all the others on the stereo bus. These tiny plus symbols remind you that the signal is added or mixed to all the others on that same bus. And this main mix goes out through the stereo fader to the stereo out sockets, and also to the headphones and monitor outputs if the monitor select switch is set to stereo. Now the send signals are almost a mirror image. They join up with all the other send signals on the send buses. You can see a vertical line for 1 and 2. Now the main signals are all controlled en masse by this stereo level fader. So is there an equivalent for the send signals? Well, yes, there is. It's these master level controls here. Master 1 controls the overall level for all send 1 signals, and Master 2 controls all Send 2 signals. Now these controls are also on the front panel, and their levels are shown in the mixer screen. Now this can be confusing as the master level is replicated for each selected item. It's not really a separate level for each. I set Master 1 to 20. Every input shows it as 20. And this is probably why the master section is coloured differently from the individual send levels. Just like on the front panel here, the two masters are outside of the grey box. So when you're adjusting master levels, there's no need to select the required input first. Now later we'll see that tracks also have their own send levels. But these two are all subject to the same master level. So if master 1 is 0, all send 1 signals will be 0, regardless of their individual send levels. Right, so what goes into the internal send effect? Well, it's send 1, and only send 1. Now both send 1 and 2 go to the outside world, but only send 1 goes to the internal effect as well. So if you don't want to use the internal effect, you can just turn it off in the effect screen. And either way, send 1 is always available for external use. So you need to set up quite a few things to get signals into the internal effect. You need to open the mixer screen for the selected input, turn send 1 on by setting it to either pre or post, depending on your requirements. Then turn up the levels for send 1 and make sure master 1 is also set as required. And if you want to use external send signals, you do exactly the same, but this time you can use either send 1 or send 2 or both. So we've seen how to send signals internally and externally. How do we return them? Well, with external effects, your only choice is to use spare inputs. Now other mixers may have extra inputs called returns, and sometimes these are simplified inputs with no EQ, say, or less routing. But there are no hard and fast rules. You can use any inputs you like. The one thing to watch, make sure that those return inputs are not also sending signals to the same send bus. Otherwise you'll get a feedback loop. Either turn the send off or turn its send level down to 0. This is another advantage of always starting off with the mixer in a known state. So how about the internal send effect? We can see the output here. There are two paths, so the effect itself generates a stereo signal. Both left and right outputs are controlled by its return level, and this is adjusted in the effect screen. So if the return is 0, you won't get any output from the effect. Doesn't matter what you send into it, nothing will come out. The next switch is the bounce switch, which is shown here in the off position. So that agrees with what we're doing. And the signal flows straight through onto our old friend, the stereo bus. So the internal send effect is mixed with everything else on that bus. And you now know how to follow this through to the stereo output and the monitor output as before. Okay, that's nearly it. No real catches this time, just a couple of tips. If the sends are not working or they're too quiet, check the individual send level and master level in the mixer screen. And if you're using the internal effect, check the return level in the effect screen. And just note the return level is common to the different types. So if we set this to 30 for the reverb, when we change the effect to be a chorus, the return level is still 30. So this value is common, just like the on and off is common, because there is only one effect. Another tip, you can save your ears and speakers from feedback accidents by keeping the master levels at 0 until needed. Now the on-off and pre-post select mechanism is potentially dangerous as it passes through the pre position before it reaches the post position. We have the effect off, we have to go through pre before we get to post. And as we've already seen, pre means the level faders have no effect, so you'll get the full input signal going to the sends for that brief period of time. Now there's a library system for send effects, for saving and restoring any of your settings. Now this library is global, so it's retained across all songs, but I think it only holds settings which are shown in the effect screen. It won't save your send levels, for example. So you could still use the song template system as described earlier for these. Just to wrap up, it may help to put this send system into context if we take a quick look at traditional analog mixers. And if you've ever been phased by all those knobs, you should now be able to spot the send or aux controls. This one by Allen and Heath has 6 sends in total, although they've compromised on the knob count by having a button which switches these 2 knobs between sends 3 and 4 and 5 and 6. And these are the individual send levels. These are the master send levels. And here are the pre and post switches. Unlike the Tascam, this mixer has extra dedicated inputs for the effect return signals. They have less functionality than the normal inputs, but as we've seen, you can return the signals anywhere you like. Here's a Mackie mixer with a similar arrangement. 6 sends shared across 4 knobs. Here's the pre and post switch. Now it only affects sends 1 and 2, and the others are fixed as post fader. Here's the master send level, and the dedicated returns are even simpler, just a level control. And finally, here's a nice dinky mixer by Behringer. We're back to 2 sends like the Tascam, but no pre or post switches. One of the sends is pre-wired as pre-fader and the other as post-fader. And just to remind you of the typical uses for pre and post signals, the pre-fader knob is called monitor send and the post-fader is called FX send. Right, one more thought if you're not asleep yet. I mentioned using your imagination earlier, so how about an example? Now, technically, an effect is anything which affects the signal. So you even get spelling tips here. So why stick to traditional effects like compressors and reverbs? How about an EQ? It affects the signal. Now the EQ on each input here, and each track as we'll see later, is effectively already being used as an insert effect. When it's on, it's inserted, and when it's off, it's bypassed. So if you don't like the sound of this EQ, and sometimes this can be a deal breaker, there's nothing to stop you using one or even two external EQs as send effects. You would turn the internal EQ off, connect one of the send outputs to your external EQ, and feed the output back into a spare input. Now we want it to behave as an insert effect, so we need to kill the original dry signal. So just turn its level down. And this is where your knowledge of pre and post comes in handy, because you'll need to use the pre-fader signal so that turning the dry level down does not affect the send signal to your EQ. Job done. Okay, apologies again for all the diversions, but hopefully it bridges the gap between what user manuals normally tell you, the how, and what you really wanted to know, the why. Next time we'll start using all these nice tactile track faders to make this operate like a more conventional mixer. And it will also give us access to the third and final type of effect, the insert guitar effect. So see you then, and thanks for watching.